Hey guys, welcome to your AP Psychology review. Just a little prep work before we get into some of the content for Unit 1. Monday, May 1st is your AP exam. Make sure that you are prepared. That means that make sure that you have pre-registered with guidance. All of that information will be coming out shortly. Make sure that you have pens and pencils and erasers. You can have water with you, but everything else just leave somewhere else. If you needed to leave it in my classroom, by all means, please do. It should begin at 1 o'clock, but I will double check on lunch and everything else for you guys prior to that date. The big thing is be there, be seated. Please do not be late. It is a 2-hour exam. Traditionally, this exam starts at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. That means that you are done at 3 o'clock. School gets out at 2:35. So if you are a person who takes the bus, make sure that you have transportation ready. Part 1 is multiple choice. It's 100 multiple choice questions, and guess what? It's like what you've practiced all year long with me. You have 70 minutes. That is far longer than you've had to answer 100 multiple choice and answer a single essay in my class. So take your time, breathe, and do well. Here's the great thing. Every question counts, so there is no true penalty for guessing. Make sure that if you even come down to 2 possible options, you go with your gut and guess. The second part is the free response question part. Same essay format that we've practiced in class. Now there is a chance that they may vary it. In years past, they've asked people to graph something. We have not practiced this in class because my expectation is that you guys know how to take data and put it on a XY axis and graph things out. If you don't, please come see me so we can talk about this. The other part, you might have one like you had from your midterm where I have 2 terms and you have to associate them with each other. But everything else is probably scenario. And just like in class, as long as you can explain yourself and apply it to what they're asking, you're fine. The big thing is make sure you answer the question. Don't run off on a tangent. Make sure that you define, apply, and answer. You get 2 questions. You get 50 minutes, so roughly 25 minutes per question. If you were to add 25 minutes to that 70 minutes up top, that's 95 minutes. There's no way that we ever start our test the minute you walk in class, and most of you guys are done way before then. So you have 95 minutes to do what we do in class in about 80 minutes. You also then have another 25 minutes or so to address another question. You will have plenty of time. Breathe. You will be fine. Additional things that you guys should look at. Now this I got from a site a couple years ago, and exactly how correct it is on the point scale, that's kind of, I don't know, up in the air. But if you assume that this test has about 150 points, 100 from the multiple choice, and let's say 50 from the free response, in other words, it's about, a third to a 2/3 split. Well, this is what one person had put out there, and again, this is just kind of a general idea. But if you're looking at it, you guys have to know at least half of the content. Half of the content, even a little bit less than half the content. If you get half of it correct, you're sitting at a 3. Now there's not a single person in that class that doesn't know half of the content that I taught. What I'm hoping for and what I truly expect from you guys is 4s and 5s. You all know this material. You know it very well. And if you're here reviewing with me, that means that you are dedicating yourself to doing well on this test. Alright guys, let's start reviewing Unit 1. The only reason I'm giggling is this is the 5th time I've done this because my phone keeps ringing. So, for Unit 1, I'm going to put up a whole bunch of terms. And this is just the first half of the slide. Now, there's not going to be a whole lot for you to look at. I really just kind of want you to read through the list and figure out if you know what you need to know from this. So, if there is something that you feel like you don't know or I don't cover well enough, remember you have Crash Course and you still have accessibility to me in class to ask questions. Please, please, please ask questions. Even if we're on a different topic, I will try to cover it. The other thing is you still have access to all the PowerPoints. So remember, you can always go back and use all of that information that I left for you on Blackboard. All right, so before my phone rings again, let's see if I can get through this slide. All right, psychology. That is going to be the science of or the study of behavior and mental processes. Remember behavior, go right back to the behaviorist. This is going to be the purely observable. Now that could be your heart rate, or that could be why you flinch when you see a big dog. But it's going to be observable behavior. Then we get to the mental processes part, and that's going to be cognition. It's going to be memory. It's going to be problem solving. It's going to be thinking. It's going to be unconscious motives. It's going to be anything that's happening in that kind of internal structure. And together that brings together all forms of psychology, humanism, psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, behavioral. Everybody kind of comes together in this definition. Phrenology is going to be pseudopsychology. So remember, every once in a while you're going to run into somebody who thinks that Freud is the father of psychology, and touching someone's bumps on their head tells you something about their personality. Phrenology, it doesn't work. If you have a bump on your head, it's not telling you about your personality. It probably means that if your personality changed due to a bump, you had brain damage. So phrenology is pseudopsychology. This term may pop up on the AP exam, but this is that 1 in a million type thing, very rarely seen. But then we get into the beginning of psychology. Now remember, we have the father of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, and he's going to be in Leipzig, Germany, and he's going to have the first formal laboratory dedicated to psychology. Well, Wundt technically wasn't going to be a structuralist. Structuralism comes from Wundt. So his study becomes later termed as structuralist, and his students kind of bring forward structuralism. So again, structuralism at the heart of it is looking at the structure of the conscious experience. Now I know I told you guys before, back in Leipzig, Germany, Wundt would sit there with a person and he would have them record when they heard the ticking of a watch. They were using what was called introspection. When did they internally understand? When did they internally respond to? When did they record this event? Now we still use introspection today. It's helpful for me to ask you, how does this make you feel? What does this make you think of? It isn't a flawed tool, but it is a tool, which means it is not used for every situation, but it still is applicable. Now, Wundt used introspection. Structuralists would have used introspection. And again, they were worried about, or not worried, but concerned about the structure of the conscious experience. What did it mean to be conscious? What was the here and the now, the present? What made our brain or our mind what it is? And again, they utilized introspection. Then we get William James, and William James deviates a little bit from Wundt, and he becomes a functionalist. He felt that it was far more important for us to understand the purpose of the conscious experience as opposed to the building blocks of the conscious experience. So just use this really quick analogy. You are looking at the blocks to build a wall versus the purpose of a wall. So we wouldn't say the purpose of the wall is bricks. We'd say the purpose of a wall is to hold up a structure or to keep something on the other side, whatever it meant. But the functionalists looked at the conscious experience and they weren't really concerned about what did it do, but what was its purpose. After the functionalists, we get into the Gestalt psychologists. And if you don't remember Gestalt, this is German for the whole. And the Gestalt psychologists, this is when we got into perception. So we went from sensation into perception, but perception is literally the fact that our environment is a best facsimile of what our brain is putting together for us. And so the Gestalt psychologists looked at perceptual units. It looked at how we could use illusions to kind of show us what our brain is manufacturing for us. Psychodynamic and psychoanalytic. The big word for this, and I've been saying it all year long, unconscious. Freud wanted to know about unconscious motives. Even his students like Jung and Adler still looked at the unconscious. So I've told you before, if you need to remember psychodynamic or psychoanalytic, it is the only one that starts with the psycho, and let's be honest, Freud was a little out there. Then we get to the behaviorists, and you guys know I like the behaviorists. This is going to be Watson and Skinner and Pavlov and Bandura. This is the purely observable, the sciencey science of it all. So behaviorists were not concerned about the conscious experience. If we went back to that first definition, they wanted purely observable. They weren't so concerned about the inner workings. Now today, most people are cognitive behaviorists, but the kind of original format for this was, why did somebody do something? What did we observe? But we would never really ask them what they felt or what they thought, just can we record what we saw? So this is baby Albert, this is Pavlov's dog. This is purely observable psychology. Then we get into the humanists. And the humanists, that's going to be Rogers, that's going to be Maslow. That is the idea that there is a significant difference between humans and animals. that we're not guided by the unconscious or these desires that we can't really regulate. They were the most philosophical and the most hopeful of all the psychologists. And so again, with the humanist psychologists, we're talking about self-actualization, we're talking about client-centered therapy, all of these wonderful kind of concepts. The humanists are going to be the ones that do not really address the propensity for evil in people, but the idea of positive human growth. Cognitive psychology. This is your memories, how your brain works to record and to retrieve information. This is how your brain problem solves. This is how your brain organizes information into schemas. This is going to be Piaget. This is going to be Loftus. This is going to be all of this kind of very interesting, but very much based on the functioning of the brain and how it helps us work. So when I think of cognitive, I think of a really kind of intricate clock and all the cogs working together to make it work as one. Every little gear is going to fit into another gear and it will work together. Cognitive psychology looks at all the gears in our brain. Social psychology. This is going to be that lovely meld between the environment and the individual. And social psychology looks at the individual within the environmental context and how the environment can impact, shape, and mold the way that we interpret, the way that we behave, the way that we respond to others. So those are going to be kind of the big chunks or perspectives that you need to remember. Then we get into the nature-nurture debate. Is it your environment or is it your genetics? So nature is always genetics, nurture is always your environment. Did you become a caring and empathetic person because it's in your DNA, or was it because you were given a caring and empathetic environment to grow up and model? Psychology versus psychiatry. Chances are you might get a question on this, not so certain though. Psychology, if you want to be a psychologist, you can study any of the previous listed perspectives. You can go into things like therapy, you have IO psychology, you have all these other branches that you can go into. If you want to get into psychiatry, a psychiatrist is going to be a person who also has a medical degree. So they will be a clinical psychologist with a full licensed medical degree. So they can be any kind of doctor and they're a psychologist. Marry them together. They are the only ones in the psychology kind of profession that can prescribe medication. Important people for you to know. John Locke. So Locke talked about the tabula rasa, that we were born as a blank slate, that we are waiting for the environment to be written upon us. Very, very much someone who is going to be in the nurture category. Descartes is going to be the opponent to Locke, and Descartes is going to be very much in the DNA kind of category, that we are born with things that we're waiting to discover. Hippocrates, you might want to know for the Hippocratic Oath. Really just feel like we can gloss past that one, but even psychologists have to promise not to harm the people that they are helping. Wundt, father of psychology, Leipzig, Germany, first laboratory dedicated to this science. William James, student of Wundt, and James is going to be credited with the very first textbook in psychology. I know that seems strange, but it's one of those facts that you should know. And really, he brings psychology to America. And then we got good old Freud. Freud is just pop psychology. People know Freud. Psychodynamic, psychoanalytic perspective. It's worth noting Freud. Okay guys, we're going into Unit 2. Now please don't freak out. I know we didn't talk about every single important person that we had covered before, even in Unit 1 in class, but understand that a lot of these people pop up again in the next units. They'll get covered. There are going to be some fundamental people like Hall that you should still remember as the first president of the APA, and then there's going to be a couple of those other ancillary. Please don't take this as an exclusive review. You need to go back and review some of the other fine points. All right, now we're going to go into the Unit 2 review topics. So again, Unit 2, really this is talking about research methods. Please know the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. Kind of think of a hypothesis as a small segment of a theory. Literally, it translates into mini theory. This is going to look at an aspect of. So you have things like the social learning theory that was put forward by Bandura, and he talked about vicarious learning, and he looked at modeling, and it was an entire kind of umbrella of social learning theory. But when he did the Bobo doll experiment, he hypothesized a very small portion of that theory. And that was that when children watch someone act aggressively, they will then later represent that same behavior. The hypothesis will have your independent and your dependent variables. It will be measurable. Each of those variables has to have an operational definition. In other words, you can't just tell me that you are going to measure whether or not people do better in school when they get more sleep, because I don't know what you mean by do better, and I don't know what you really truly mean by more sleep. So if my independent variable, the manipulated variable, is going to be getting more sleep, I need to literally say subjects in my research will get 8 hours of sleep. And this will impact, and then I need to define my dependent variable. I need to know what do better means. This will impact, or they will show a statistical improvement in their grades. The entire purpose of an operational definition is to allow for replication. If I define exactly what I'm doing, then somebody can take that information and they can run another series of experimentation with the exact same criteria and either prove my work to be valid and reliable or that it is not. When we look at doing research, we have to look at our population. The population is going to be the group of people that your research can then later speak to. Now, obviously, you can't use the entire population in your research. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to pull a sample. So if you kind of think about it like a restaurant, if you were to get a sampler platter from the appetizers, they don't give you one of every single appetizer. They give you a pretty good representation of what's on the menu. All right, so population, if we are looking at 70% Caucasian and 13% African American and maybe another 7% Hispanic, and if we're looking at that and you want to get a good sample and we're going for the US population, then if you grab a sample of 50 people, 70% should be Caucasian, 13 or 12% should be African American, 7% should be Hispanic. There should be about a 50-50 split between male and female. The sample should look like a smaller version of the overall population. Different research methods will come up. Now, I know I have it set up with descriptive and then experimental, but let's just flip it really quick and let's go right down to experimental research. Since we're talking about this right now, experimental research, you're looking at the independent and dependent variable. Now, you will have a hypothesis for all sorts of different research methods, but for experimentation specifically, you have the independent and your dependent variables, which must have definitions applied to them. You need to know that if you're talking about aggression, you're talking about an elevated heart rate, or the number of times someone pulls someone's hair, or the number of nasty comments a person makes, whatever it might be, but you need to define it. Your independent variable is manipulated. Your dependent variable measures the manipulation. If I am doing something like caffeine consumption and grade point average, I will say that my subjects will increase their caffeine consumption to 5 cups of coffee a day. I have no idea what that would be in milligrams. And their resulting test scores will increase by. So I'm telling you what I'm manipulating, my dependent variable will be my measurement of it. Then you have your experimental and your control conditions. Your experimental condition is going to be the one that has the independent variable. Your control condition is going to be the one that is not subjected to the independent variable. However, it may have a placebo. So this is, let's say we're doing diet research. Your experimental group, they get the diet drug, and the control group gets a sugar pill. The idea being that with a placebo, you're trying to see whether or not it is really truly the independent variable that is doing the job, or whether or not it is some other factor. And that leads us into confounding variables. A confounding variable is going to be some third or outside variable that may impact the research. Now, we can also talk about extraneous variables. This would be another variable that happens to appear in the research that can have an impact as well. For the AP exam, confounding and extraneous, just keep them together as an extra variable that may somehow impact the research. Other research methods, let's go back to descriptive. Case studies. A case study is going to be a unique situation or set of situations that we can't ethically recreate, and that we will gain information just by looking at that person's situation and their history. So if we're looking at something like fetal alcohol syndrome, We have to use case studies, and later we can actually even make correlational statements off of the case studies. We cannot ethically recreate that situation, so it's best for us to learn from situations that are naturally occurring. Surveys are valuable. Yes, people lie in surveys. People lie in a lot of things, but you cannot just sit there and say that surveys aren't useful. So while they do have a flaw, just like every other thing has a flaw, surveys allow us to get people's perceptions, their input, their thought, and their feelings on things in a much easier way than really any other research method. Naturalistic observation, watching someone or something in its natural environment. So in this case, the researcher is going to try to blend into the background and just observe as it is. But again, they should have some form of a hypothesis, some kind of organized set of criteria that they intend to observe. Other terms that you guys want to have in mind. Random assignment. When we look at random assignment, this is how you are going to separate your sample into your control and your experimental conditions. Now, random assignment should help control for those confounding variables. So let's say you have a population of people, and some people are kind of night owls and other people are, early birds. Well, if you randomly assign, literally like taking names out of a hat, you should have a pretty good distribution of night owls and early birds in each condition. That confounding variable should then eliminate itself. When we look at reliability and validity, reliability, I always go back to my car analogy. You want a reliable car and a valid mechanic. Something that is reliable, does what it's supposed to do over and over and over again. So a reliable car turns on every single time you want it to turn on. Reliable research gives you the exact same data points every single time you run the research. Maybe not the exact same, but you get the same trend, the same behavior. If it's valid, it measures what it intends to measure. So valid research can have internal and external validity. When we're looking at it, it can have content validity, predictive validity, and we'll go into more of those concepts when we get into the entire testing portion of the review. But with validity, we're looking at, does it measure what it intended to measure? So you take it to a valid mechanic. Is he certified to work on your car? Does he have the right criteria? So if you have a reliable car, you get the same results every single time, and if you have a valid mechanic, they are meant to work on your car. Valid research is going to focus on what it's supposed to focus on. If it's reliable, it'll get the same results. Talked about the placebo effect. About the use of a placebo. Placebo effect is when you have people respond to a placebo in a way like they would to the actual drug or the independent variable. So again, when we look at this, we use placebos to filter out this possible effect to see whether or not someone loses weight because of positive thinking or if they lose weight because of a pill. Double-blind design or double-blind procedure. This is important. We utilize the double-blind procedure to prevent researcher bias. Now, there is a single-blind procedure. Single-blind means that the subjects do not know which group they're in. That means they're not aware that they're in the experimental or the control group. They just know that they are in the experiment. Double blind means that all of those people are coded with a number or a color or whatever, but they're coded, and that the researcher doesn't know if they're dealing with the experimental condition or the control condition until after they've run the research and collected the data. This means that they are blind to which condition they're dealing with, and therefore, so they don't influence their research, they treat them as a standard case. The subjects can't sit there and change the way that they behave to tip off the researcher because they are also blind to what group they're in, and therefore the research should be done with kind of the truest fashion in mind. They should be completely free of bias, or as close to free of bias as we can get. Descriptive statistics. We'll look at this a little bit more because I need to talk to you guys about skew. But descriptive statistics, we're looking at measures of central tendency. This is your mode, your mean, and your median. Now I feel like these are really kind of very basic concepts and you guys know them. So mean, mode, and median. Your mean is your average. Your mode is your most common occurring number. And your median, like right down the center of a road, it is the middle number. It is the median. All right, inferential statistics. Statistical significance. This is the 5% rule. Now, if you're taking a stats class, they are going to argue this, but for AP right now, for this exam, know the 5% rule. we will allow up to 5% variation. So if it's within 5%, we will say something is statistically significant. It did not occur to chance. Really meta-analysis, this is going to be looking at your data and breaking it down into kind of further descriptive information. This is going to be standard deviations, and we'll talk about that a little bit here, I believe, in the next slide. All right, informed consent. When you do research, you have to provide someone with informed consent. You guys have done this with your remake of the classical conditioning experiment. In other words, you have to let people know that they are allowed to leave the research at any time, that they will not be harmed. And usually most of this has to go through an institutional review board. That is a group of people who are going to do oversight to make sure that you are following the rules of ethics. Debriefing is required if you choose to be deceptive. So deception is allowed in research. You are allowed to lie. But if you choose to be deceptive, and in some cases deception is required, you have to then debrief. At the end of your research, not only tell them what the purpose of your research is, but then explain to them fully how they were deceived. Correlational studies. Correlational coefficients are going to be the numbers that you see down there. They can range anywhere from 1 to a -1. And yes, this is written with the flip-flop, with not the negative on the left and the positive on the right, because those don't matter. What it tells you is direction of travel. So a positive correlation, as one data point increases, the other data point increases. Or if you want to look at it in the reverse, as one data point decreases, the other data point decreases. They go in the same direction. Negative correlation, as one increases, the other decreases, and you can flip that around and it will sound the exact same way. As one increases, the other decreases. That's a negative correlation. What you guys are looking at down here are what we would call a scatter plot. The closer the dots on the line come to forming a line, the closer you are getting to a stronger correlation, meaning that there is a trend or a reason behind the information. When you look at something that is a 0, that means there is no correlation. So the negative 0.8 is not less than the positive 0.3. In fact, the negative 0.8 shows a stronger relationship between the two data points than the 0.3. So it just happens to tell you the direction of travel. Drawbacks with correlations. Correlations cannot tell you causation. Big rule of psychology, research, and everything in general. Experimentation is the only thing that can tell you causation. So an experiment can give you cause and effects, correlations can't. Correlations can tell you the relationship between variables. Here's where reading becomes very important on this exam. You need to read. If you hear words like tends to, relationship between, seems to, probably talking about a correlation. If you sit there and read causes, that is only an experiment. So if you have a question about correlations and it tells you sleep causes, that cannot be a correct answer. Causal statements can only be applied to experimentation. Last topic for this entire kind of quick flyby of the first unit. When we look at frequency distributions, we also kind of need to talk about skew. So the very first thing you have is usually what we would consider the bell curve. So this is a perfect distribution, the mean, the mode, the median, all smack dab lovely in the center. And if we were looking at something like the frequency distribution for IQ scores, we would say that the standard deviation is 15 points. And so the center line would be 100, and then you would have a 15.1 standard deviation away, etc., etc. When we're looking at something that is negatively skewed, a negative skew is when we can basically add a value far below the mean, and it will actually cause the average to lower, making more data points to the kind of positive side of the graph. Positive skew is the exact opposite. We have a data point that is far above the average, meaning that the average then becomes kind of an outlier, and the mode and the median come a little bit lower than that, and so you have more of the data points before the average. What I really want you guys to do with this is just look at them. A negative skew has very little information towards the lower end of the graph. A positive skew has little or less information kind of towards the higher number end of the graph. Read through the explanation at the bottom. Again, you may get 1 or 2 questions on this, probably just one if you get one at all. you just want to kind of keep these things in mind. With standard deviation, when we're talking about standard deviation, you do want to remember that when we're looking at standard deviation and range, the greater the range, the larger the spread of numbers, the greater the standard deviation. The tighter or the closer packed numbers, the smaller the standard deviation.